The morning my daughter stopped recognizing my voice, something inside me went very still. Not the kind of still that comes with peace, the kind that comes when your body already knows what your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Claire was 34 years old, lying in a hospital bed at MUSC in Charleston, and she looked at me like I was a stranger, standing in a doorway she didn't remember leaving open. The doctors called it a complication from the treatment. I called it the moment I decided I would do absolutely anything. Anything turned out to mean more than I expected. I had worked as a registered nurse for 31 years. I retired at 61 thinking I had seen the worst the world had to offer: the midnight codes, the families waiting in hallways, the paperwork you fill out when someone doesn't make it. I thought I understood grief. I thought I understood what it meant to fight for someone's life. But nothing in those 3 decades prepared me for watching my own child slip away while insurance forms sat unanswered on my kitchen table. Claire needed a specialized treatment, a clinical program up in Boston that had shown real results for her condition, a rare autoimmune disorder that had been stealing her piece by piece for 2 years. The program cost $240,000. My retirement savings held $43,000. My house in Mount Pleasant was mortgaged. My late husband had left me with love and memories, and very little else. And I do not say that with bitterness. He was a good man. He just died too soon. And the world is expensive. And my daughter was disappearing. My friend Dorothy called me one Tuesday afternoon. Dorothy and I had worked the same floor at Roper for 12 years, and she had a habit of knowing things before other people knew them. She said she had heard something, and she felt strange telling me, but she thought I deserved to know. A man named Robert Harlan was looking for a companion. Not a romantic arrangement, she said carefully. A practical one. He was 74 years old, a retired circuit court judge, and he had been diagnosed with a degenerative heart condition 14 months earlier. His doctors had given him a year, possibly a little more with the right medications and reduced stress. He was a widower. He had a large estate in the Lowcountry outside Beaufort. And he had, according to Dorothy, grown tired of spending his remaining time alone. I told Dorothy she had lost her mind. She said maybe so, but she gave me his attorney's phone number anyway, and I left it on the kitchen counter for 4 days before I called. Robert Harlan was not what I imagined. I had assembled a picture of him from the few details Dorothy shared. Formal, distant, the way men of his generation and profession sometimes are. The man who met me for coffee at a small place on Bay Street was wearing a flannel shirt and reading a paperback western, and he stood up when I walked in before I had even introduced myself, because Dorothy had apparently described me down to my coat. He shook my hand and said he appreciated me coming. He had kind eyes and a stillness about him that I recognized from years of working with patients who had made peace with hard news. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about his wife Margaret. I told him I went by Maggie, and he smiled at the coincidence. He told me about his years on the bench, the cases that stayed with him, the ones he wished had gone differently. I told him about Claire. I don't know why I told him so much, so quickly, but there was something about sitting across from someone who was also counting days that made the usual caution feel beside the point. He said he wasn't looking for love. He said he had had that, and he was grateful, and he wasn't expecting or asking for it again. What he wanted was companionship. Someone to have dinner with, someone to sit with him on the porch in the evenings when the marsh went gold, someone to be present, so that the house didn't feel like a waiting room. He said he had spoken with his attorney and could offer a formal arrangement, a marriage of companionship, with a structured financial agreement that would provide for medical expenses for an immediate family member in need, in exchange for my presence and care during whatever time he had left. He slid a business card across the table. His attorney's name was Franklin Wells. I told him I needed to think about it. He said of course. He paid for the coffee and held the door open and said he hoped I would call either way, just to let him know. I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. I called Franklin Wells the next morning. The paperwork took 3 weeks. Franklin was thorough and careful, and I had my own attorney, a woman named Patricia Owens, review everything twice. The agreement was clean. Robert was clear-eyed about what it was and what it wasn't. When we signed, he looked at me across the conference table and said quietly that he hoped this would be good for both of us. I believed him. I flew to Boston with Claire's medical files the following Monday, and by the end of that week, she was enrolled in the program. I moved into the Harlan estate the first week of October. The house was old and beautiful in the way old southern houses sometimes are: wide porches, live oaks draped with Spanish moss, a view of the marsh that changed color every hour depending on the light. Robert had a housekeeper named Dottie who came 3 days a week, and a groundskeeper named Earl who had worked the property for 20 years. They were both warm to me in a careful way, like people waiting to see how a new situation would settle before they committed to it. His son Thomas arrived 11 days after I moved in. Thomas Harlan was 46 years old and worked in commercial real estate in Charlotte. He was tall like his father, but without the stillness he had an energy that moved through rooms like weather. His wife Diane came with him, and she assessed me in the way some women do. A single long look that takes inventory and reaches conclusions before a word is exchanged. She had perfect nails and called me Margaret in a voice that made it sound like a correction. They stayed for a weekend. At dinner the first night, Thomas asked his father very specific questions about the estate, the acreage, the current property valuation, whether the Beaufort account had been consolidated with the Charleston holdings. Robert answered patiently. I noticed he was patient in the way that people are when they have answered the same questions many times. On Sunday morning I came downstairs early and found Diane in the kitchen. She was looking at the medication bottles on the counter, not reading them casually the way someone might glance at a label. She was holding one, turning it, checking the dosage. She set it down when she heard me and smiled and said she was just making sure her father-in-law was taking care of himself. I smiled back and said that was very thoughtful. I had been a nurse for 31 years. I knew what checking a label looks like, and I knew what it doesn't look like. I said nothing else, but I noticed. Robert had 3 medications: a beta blocker, a blood thinner, and a newer cardiac drug his specialist in Savannah had prescribed 2 months before I arrived. He was disciplined about taking them. He had a weekly pill organizer, always filled on Sunday nights, and he kept the bottles in a specific order on the kitchen counter by the window. About 3 weeks after Thomas and Diane's visit, Robert began having worse days. He had always had a range. Some mornings he was energetic, wanted to walk the property, told long stories about cases he had tried. Other days he stayed in his chair and tired quickly. But this was different. He was more fatigued than his doctors had anticipated. He was confused in small ways. He asked me twice on the same afternoon where he had put his reading glasses, which were in his shirt pocket. His color wasn't right. I called his cardiologist in Savannah and described what I was seeing. The doctor said it sounded like disease progression and adjusted one of his medications, lowering the dose of the blood thinner slightly. Robert improved a little. Then Thomas called to say he and Diane would be coming again for Thanksgiving, and could they bring some of the supplements they had read about, some herbal compounds that had shown promise for cardiac patients in a study Diane had found online. I told Thomas, politely, that his father's medications were managed by a specialist, and any changes should go through the doctor. Thomas said, of course. He understood completely. They brought the supplements anyway. They were in small amber bottles, no pharmacy label, just a handwritten note that said Dr. Chen's cardiac support formula. Robert said Thomas had been very enthusiastic about them, and he didn't want to dismiss his son's concern. I waited until Thomas and Diane had gone to bed. I sat with Robert at the kitchen table and I told him, plainly, that I was not comfortable with supplements from an unlicensed source being added to a carefully managed cardiac regimen. I told him I had seen interactions cause serious harm. I said it gently, but I said it clearly. Robert looked at the bottles for a long moment, and then said he trusted my judgment, and he told me to do whatever I thought was right. I put the bottles in a paper bag and drove to a Walgreens the next morning. I bought a small lockbox. I placed Robert's prescription medications in the lockbox and gave him the only key. I told him this was just to keep things organized. Then I took one of the amber supplement bottles to a pharmacist I had known for years, a man named Gerald at a compounding pharmacy on Boundary Street. I told him I was concerned about the contents and asked if he could tell me anything from the smell and the color. Gerald looked at it carefully and said he couldn't identify anything definitively without testing, but the consistency looked unusual for an herbal supplement. He gave me the name of a lab in Colombia that did independent analysis. I mailed a sample that afternoon. While I waited, I watched. Diane had taken to stopping by on her own. Thomas was traveling for work, she said, but she liked to check on her father-in-law. She always brought food. Soups, herbal teas in branded packets. She would brew the tea herself and bring it to Robert in his chair, and she would stay and talk and refill the cup. She was attentive in a way that looked like devotion, and felt, to me, like something else. One evening I came in from the porch and saw her at the kitchen counter. She had Robert's pill organizer open. Her back was to me. I watched for a moment before I cleared my throat. She closed the organizer and turned around and said she had just been checking whether he had taken his evening dose. She said it with perfect composure. I said I had already watched him take it. She smiled and picked up her purse and said she'd see herself out. I opened the pill organizer after she left. The Thursday and Friday compartments looked different. The tablets were the same color, roughly the same size, but the shape was slightly off. I photographed them with my phone. Then I called Patricia Owens and told her I needed to speak with Franklin Wells. I met with Franklin the following morning. I brought the photographs. I brought the sample receipt from the lab in Columbia. I brought my written notes, dates, times, observations, everything I had documented over the past 4 weeks, because I had started keeping notes the morning I saw Diane reading those labels, because 31 years of nursing teaches you to document before you need to, not after. Franklin was very still while I talked. When I finished, he asked me 2 questions. He asked whether Robert knew what I suspected. I said not in full. He asked whether anyone else had been told. I said only Patricia. Franklin said he was going to make a phone call. The lab results came back 6 days later. The supplement contained a compound that, in combination with Robert's blood thinner, would gradually thin his blood to dangerous levels. It would look, to a doctor reviewing records without context, like disease progression. It would look like the medication wasn't working. It would not look like what it was. Franklin had already contacted the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office. I told Robert that evening. We sat on the porch and I told him everything, slowly and carefully, the way you tell someone hard news when you want them to understand all of it, and not just the shock of it. He didn't speak for a long time. The marsh was going dark and the egrets were settling into the oaks, and he sat very still with his hands on the arms of his chair. He said he had known, in the way you know things you don't want to know, that something was wrong. He said he had told himself it was the disease. He said Thomas had been asking about the will since his mother passed, in ways that were never quite direct enough to confront. He reached over and put his hand over mine, and he said thank you. I did not sleep well that night. Not from fear, but from something harder to name. I had come to this house as a practical arrangement. I had come to earn something for my daughter. I had kept my professional instincts because they were the only tools I trusted. And somewhere in the middle of pill organizers and amber bottles and late evenings on a porch watching waterbirds settle into the oaks, something had shifted that I had not planned on and could not quite account for. The sheriff's investigators came on a Thursday morning. Thomas was reached by phone in Charlotte. He arrived the following day with a defense attorney and a very controlled expression. Diane said very little. The pharmaceutical analysis report was entered into evidence. My documentation was thorough enough that the investigator told Franklin it was among the clearest records of this kind she had processed. Thomas and Diane were arrested 6 days later. The charges included elder abuse and attempted poisoning. There would be a long legal process, and I will not pretend it was clean or simple, but the path to it was clear because I had documented everything, because I had moved carefully and early, because I had not waited until I was certain before I started building the record. Robert's cardiologist in Savannah reviewed his recent blood work after we removed the supplements and the tampered tablets. She said his actual cardiac function was more stable than the recent tests had suggested. She said whatever was accelerating his decline appeared to have been external, not the disease itself. She said he might have considerably more time than anyone had thought. He looked at me when she said it. He had the same expression he'd had that first morning on Bay Street, when I'd walked into the coffee shop and he had stood up before I introduced myself. Claire finished her second treatment cycle in February. Her specialist in Boston called me on a Tuesday morning and said the markers they had been watching for 18 months had shifted in the direction they had been hoping to see. He used careful language, the language doctors use when they don't want to raise hopes they can't guarantee, but I have worked in medicine long enough to hear what is underneath careful language. I sat down on the kitchen floor and I cried for about 10 minutes. Then I got up and washed my face and went to find Robert. He was in his usual chair with his paperback Western. He looked up when I came in. I didn't have to say anything. He could see it in my face. He closed the book and held out his hand, and I sat in the chair beside him, and he held my hand until I was done crying, and he didn't say anything either, because some things don't need to be spoken to be fully understood. I have thought about what people might say about this. I know how it looks from the outside, a woman my age, a financial arrangement, a marriage that started as a transaction. I understand why that raises questions. I asked myself the same questions, harder than anyone else could. But here is what I know now. Having lived through it, I came to that house as a nurse first. I saw something wrong and I documented it and I acted on it before I had proof, because waiting for proof when someone is being harmed is not caution, it is a choice. I protected a man who had offered me something real, something practical and honest, when the world had left me with very few options. And in the process of doing that, something happened that I did not plan and cannot fully explain. I did not fall in love the way people describe in stories. It was not sudden. It was not a moment. It was more like the way a room becomes familiar, the light at a certain time of day, the sound of someone's voice through a closed door, the particular way a person's face looks when they're reading something they find genuinely interesting. It crept in quietly while I was paying attention to other things. And one morning I woke up and it was simply there. Claire came to Beaufort in April. She was still tired, still cautious with herself the way people are when they have been close to something bad for a long time. But she was present. She sat with Robert on the porch and they talked about things I couldn't hear from inside the house, and when I brought iced tea out, Claire looked up at me with an expression I had not seen on her face in 2 years. Uncomplicated. Relaxed. Like someone who had come back from a long distance and recognized where she was. Robert told me that night that he found her delightful. He said it with genuine warmth, not the polite warmth of someone making an effort. I told him she had always been the best part of anything. He said he could see that. I want to be honest about the harder parts too, because stories that only offer the resolution don't serve anyone well. There were weeks when I second-guessed myself. Weeks when I sat across from Robert at dinner and felt the particular loneliness of being in a place that isn't quite yours yet, married to someone under terms that are honest and clear and still complicated in ways that don't have simple names. There were nights when I missed my house in Mount Pleasant, my small garden, the specific silence of a life that was fully mine even if it was also less than I needed. Grief doesn't arrange itself neatly. You can be grateful and also sad. You can be doing the right thing and still feel the weight of the cost of it. But I will tell you what stays with me now, sitting on that porch in the evenings when the light comes sideways through the oaks and the water goes flat and bronze. What stays with me is not the fear, and not the anger at what Thomas and Diane tried to do, and not even the relief when Claire's numbers turned. What stays with me is a quieter thing, the sense of having been, at a moment when it mattered, exactly who I had spent 31 years learning to be. Someone who watches carefully, someone who writes things down, someone who acts before the moment has passed. Robert reads his westerns, and I read my medical journals, and sometimes we talk, and sometimes we don't, and the marsh does what it does all day long, changing and settling and changing again. Thomas is awaiting trial. Diane has retained separate counsel. Franklin says the case is strong. Claire called last Thursday to tell me she had been cleared to go back to work part-time. She is a third-grade teacher. She said her students had made her a banner that said, "We missed you, Mrs. Caldwell," with drawings of her face that bore only the faintest resemblance to her actual face, and she had laughed at it until she cried. I told her that sounded about right for third grade. She said she loved me. I said I loved her too. She asked how Robert was and I said he was better, genuinely better, and that the doctor was cautiously optimistic, and that he had started finishing his westerns again instead of falling asleep in the 3rd chapter, which I had decided to count as a very good sign. She laughed and said that sounded like him, even though she had only known him for one afternoon on a porch. I thought I was making a transaction the day I signed those papers in Franklin Wells's conference room. I thought I understood exactly what I was giving and exactly what I was getting, and I thought the ledger was clear and the terms were simple. I was not wrong about the terms. I was wrong about what could grow inside them. I thought at 63 that the large surprises were behind me, that the life I had was the approximate shape of the life I would finish. I had made my peace with that. It seemed like honesty, like maturity, like the appropriate absence of hope, but I had a daughter who needed me to be wrong about that. And it turned out I was. That's the part I didn't expect. Not the danger, not the investigation, not even the arrest. The part I didn't expect was that the world had more room in it than I had allowed, that a house in the Lowcountry could become home without my permission, that a man I met for coffee could become the person I want to tell things to at the end of the day, not because the agreement requires it, but because I mean it. Not every story of sacrifice ends in loss. I used to know that from the outside. Now I know it from the inside, which is a different kind of knowing entirely.